In Module 3B, we looked at the way in which social institutions shape our understanding of sex and sexuality from a social constructionist perspective. Specifically, we explored the ways in which the media, educational institutions, and the family all impact our understanding of human sexuality. Sexualized language and imagery is an important component in today's contemporary media content. From a social constructionist theory, language and imagery is important. Language is a crucial component for us to understand reality, and it's both gendered and sexualized. Imagery also provides powerful representations of society and culture. Images give us meaning and they shape our societies. Therefore, when we see images of men and women's bodies sexualized in the media, it shapes the way in which we understand our roles, not just as gendered beings, but also as sexual beings. Of course, race, class, and ethnicity are also sexualized in media content and have been historically, as you can see here in the image of Sarah Barton, who was once known as the Hottentot Venus. Black sexuality is often portrayed as wild and animalistic, and Asian females are often hypersexualized in the media. In contrast, Asian men are often desexualized. We also touched on LGBTQIA representation in the media today and said that although there's been increased visibility in recent years, LGBTQIA folks are still widely neglected or distorted in popular media. When portrayed, LGBTQIA folks are generally put into mainstream stereotypes, or they're sensationalized as an other. In this week's discussions, many of you commented on the impact or relationship between sexuality, gender, and sport, specifically the ways in which masculinity is represented in sports such as football or boxing. We also talked about what the impact of masculinity and sport means for female athletes and those that are part of marginalized sexualities. Another social institution that plays an important role in our sexual socialization are schools or educational institutions. We talked about the ways in which schools are notoriously conservative social institutions, especially when it comes to sex and sexuality. They also promote a number of sexual double standards, as seen in dress codes, and often focus on containing the sexuality of young people, which can lead to limited open, honest, and educational discussions about sex and sexuality. However, in recent years, due to pressure among LGBTQIA students and larger organizations, schools have begun to focus on becoming safe spaces for all individuals, regardless of sexual orientation. Despite pressure for schools to become safe spaces, we know that LGBTQIA individuals continue to face harassment and discrimination in educational institutions. Research has shown that LGBTQ students still avoid certain spaces in schools where they feel uncomfortable, such as bathrooms and locker rooms. And while harassment occurs at all levels, anti-LGBTQIA violence and harassment increases dramatically in middle and high schools. We also know that cyberbullying disproportionately affects LGBTQ youth. Many young people find that college and university campuses create a more open space for talking about issues related to sex and sexuality. College and universities often offer courses such as queer theory, sexuality studies, or LGBT studies that students didn't have access to in their secondary institutions. In addition, college and universities have historically been at the forefront of the fight for gay rights and were the first schools to have gay student organizations. Traditional college students often find that they have increased freedom and autonomy, especially those that are outside of the family household for the first time, and therefore have more space to explore sexual identities, behaviors, and even their sexual orientation. We also discussed the ways in which women's colleges have faced some of the biggest struggles in talking about issues related to trans inclusion. And we talked about how collegiate hookup culture is applicable to students of all genders. But as students progress through their years in college, hooking up becomes more gendered, as female students start to think of hookups as the potential for having a relationship, while men to continue to think of hookups as just an opportunity for sexual interaction without commitment. Several folks asked if I'd speak about the weekly readings in your wrap up videos. So we'll start today with Martin and Kaziat's Heteroromantic Love and Heterosexiness in Children's G rated films. In this reading, the authors examine how heteronormativity and heterosexuality is constructed in top selling G rated movies, released between 1990 and 2005. The authors find that in a romantic context, heterosexuality is powerful, exceptional, and magical. And outside of romantic relationships, it may not be transformative, but it's consistent, entertaining, frivolous, and sometimes even crude. In the Miller article, How to Bully a Girl, the author looks at sexual rumor spreading, slut shaming, and homophobic labeling as examples of bullying among young women. Through interviews with 54 late adolescent girls, the author looks at this practice of sexual drama. The author found that all participants had experience with this kind of conflict, and nearly a third had been the subject of other girls' rumors about their sexual actions and orientations. Ultimately, the author found that while this sexual drama reproduced inequality, the practice also served as a resource for girls, one that was made useful through the institutional constraints of their high schools, which reinforced traditional gender roles and limited sexuality information. The final reading for this week was a poem by Richard Blanco that explores how sexuality is controlled, policed, and sexual surveillance. When speaking about the poem, Blanco once stated, quote, "My grandmother was as xenophobic as she was homophobic. So I remember growing up that anything that would seem culturally odd or weird or strange was also sort of tagged as queer. And I'm talking about things like Legos and Fruit Loops. So anything that she perceived as strange, she also questioned in terms of my sexuality. My grandmother was a very central figure in my life. One of those relatives that ends up doing a lot of good for you in terms of all the harm they did for you." And so this poem, which I thought at first was very poignant, angry, bitter, the first time I read it, people were just like laughing in their seats. End quote. So for your final thoughts, consider the following. In this module, we looked at the ways in which social institutions, the media, family, schools, impact sex and sexuality from a social constructionist perspective. However, these are not the only social institutions that shape our understanding of sex and sexuality. What other social institutions impact sex and sexuality in our society? How might we use a social constructionist perspective to illustrate their power?